Hello, and welcome to We Speak CVE, a free podcast from the CVE program. On this podcast, we'll talk with people from the cybersecurity community about what else, cybersecurity and vulnerability management, and the CVE catalog of vulnerabilities. If you didn't know, the CVE program's mission is to identify, define, and catalog publicly disclosed cybersecurity vulnerabilities.
Hello and welcome to the CVE Program podcast. I'm Shannon Sabens, your host and CVE Program board member. With me today, I have Todd Beardsley, a fellow CVE board member, and I'm asking Todd about his blog, an inside look at what makes the CVE program tick. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. We're recording this the day after DEF CON ended, and alas, I couldn't go to DEF CON. You couldn't go to DEF CON. Hopefully next year.
Hopefully next year. So this is a really nice article in SC Media, and I wanted to invite you to talk about it. In an inside look at what makes the CVE program tick, you reflected a little bit about the history of the program in a way that I thought was really great. And you mentioned some things that I wanted to call out to our listeners. One of the things that you called out was the explosion of CNAs, CVE Numbering Authorities. And so our membership of CNAs has grown quite a bit. Todd, how many are there?
There are a relative ton. There are, millions of organizations in the world, and 235 of them are CNAs. So relative to like all companies on Earth, very small. Relative to all open source projects, tiny, tiny, tiny. But relative to the history of CNA, huge. Or the history of CVE rather, it's huge. We're seeing, so we have 235 right now, which is about 25 more than we had 10 years ago. And I'd say that like these days we see probably one or two new CNA partners a week. I want to say that seems about right. Like we get a notification every time somebody comes through the process, and that is shockingly high considering the history. So the CVE program has really kind of embraced and moved toward this federated model of how to run CVE. As you know, software is everywhere, it's eating the world, and all software of any complexity has some number of bugs and some of those bugs are software vulnerabilities. And so as more software gets dumped out into the world, we'll have more bugs, more vulns. The federated strategy here, adopted by the CVE program, really is trying to disseminate the responsibility, right, for making new CVE IDs. And I think with some fairly notable success. So for example, like Microsoft has been a CVE partner and been a CNA forever, right? And they cover all Microsoft products, which is a lot of products. They have hundreds and hundreds of products, notably Windows, but they cover all Microsoft products. But now we have things like GitHub, which is technically part of Microsoft, but they are their own CNA, and their remit is generating CVE IDs for projects that are hosted on GitHub, which is a lot.
Yeah.
So if you run a project on GitHub and you sign up with them through their security management, it's not MITRE who is doling out these CVE IDs. It would be GitHub, and GitHub has that capability to do it themselves. Red Hat is another great example. They do a lot for Red Hat and also other Linuxy things. Apache Foundation is an open source foundation that runs a whole lot of software that everybody uses. They can churn out CVE IDs. You'll notice that like Apache and GitHub will have like GitHub as a host for open source and Apache as like a maintainer of open source. They're going to have a lot of crossover, and so you have now not just MITRE to deal with, but you have a variety of options of how to get your CVE ID. So ultimately, the idea is more hands makes for lighter work. And if there are more and more CNAs out there who are at least taking care of their own stuff, and a few of them that take care of other people's stuff, like that makes it a lot easier to get a CVE ID.
You mentioned some really great contributors to the program that are very active. But also, I want to mention the roots. JP Cert is a root, and CISA for industrial control. So there are also these roots that can help orgs in their region or in their domain that are incredibly active. And the roots are certainly helping the program to scale. But that leads me to the question, about why people should become a CNA, who's eligible to become a CNA, and why sign up for the extra work, and how much extra work is it? What are the requirements?
Unlike a lot of professional organizations, the CVE program is funded and free. So it is primarily, I think almost wholly funded by Department of Homeland Security, which is part of the U.S. government, but it is not a U.S. government only thing, right? We have members who are all over the world, lots of different governments involved. You mentioned JP Cert, that's the Japanese cert, and they are part of the Japanese government, so clearly not part of the U.S. government. You do not have to be a government to be involved in the CVE program as a CNA at all. Private companies are members, open source projects are members, even though they don't have like a salary system or HR or anything like that, right? As long as someone stands up and waves their hand and says, hey, I want to be a CNA, all you actually need to do is agree to go through the training, which is delightful. It's pretty short. You have to have a website where you publish vulnerability information about the scope of the vulnerabilities that you care about. For most organizations, it's just their stuff. There are a few other kinds of organizations we can get into a little bit later, but you have to have a place to publish that thing. And you have to agree to the CVE terms of service, which is basically you have to publish the CVEs. Like, you don't get to use CVE as like your own private bug numbering system. All CVEs will eventually become public. A lot of times people will reserve a CVE, do the work, figure out what the vulnerability is, write down the description, and then publish it. So technically there is that period where it is outside of the public view, but the ultimate destiny for every CVE ID is to be public. And then it gets to be publicly consumable by everybody on planet Earth and beyond. I assume they use CVEs in the space station. So since everyone can use it, it is, and the restrictions on it are super, super light. You basically promise to, publish them. Essentially, I think that's ultimately the only restriction. And once everybody's on that, now we have like a common framework for discussing vulnerabilities, for machines to talk about vulnerabilities to other machines, for people to talk about vulnerabilities to other people. We can all make reference to these CVE IDs. And so the kinds of organizations that sign up to be a CNA are all over the place. It's pretty tech heavy, as you might expect. But the reality is, here in the 21st century, virtually every company is in fact a tech company. Somebody somewhere in your company, I'm sure, makes a web application for something, or a mobile app, or does something techie related, right? So as long as you're like producing some kind of technology, some kind of software, which is nearly everyone, you are invited to become a CNA for at least your own stuff. CNA, by the way, stands for CVE Numbering Authority, and that means you get to write your own CVE IDs, and you can write your own descriptions and publish them along with everyone else. The size of organization doesn't matter. There's no fee for joining. There's no like dues or anything like that. That is all cheerfully paid for by me, the American taxpayer, and you, Shannon. So enjoy your CVE IDs. The size of organizations doesn't really make a difference. There are huge organizations like Microsoft, I already mentioned. There are tiny one-person organizations who are also CNAs. And so it really is open to everybody. We see CNAs that are in, medical technology, traditional software. There are the CISA, but they run industrial controls. And so that's where these CNA roots come into play, because they'll manage basically any kind of technology provider that is like medical or automotive or any kind of IoT or OT kind of stuff. It's really all over the place. Like there is, in my mind, there's no reason not to be a CNA. There's lots of upside, and you can scale the amount of work you put into it to whatever makes the most sense for you.
So just to say it again, the only requirement.
Yes. That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
That's all right. So the only requirements for becoming a CNA are to have a public vulnerability disclosure policy and to have a page or a public source for new vulnerability disclosures and to agree to the terms of use. And, it does come up sometimes that we're an organization whose administration is funded by the US government. However, we have membership in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, in China, in Taiwan, in Japan. Membership is widely open, and participation is quite broad, both in its regionality and in the kind of organizations that have sought membership. And again, in an IoT and an IIoT world, we're seeing, as you said, everything and everybody is a tech company in effect these days. So we are very open in terms of broadening our membership. But I want to, Todd, continue on this, US funded question that entities sometimes have. And there is sometimes some confusion about the relationship between CVE and the NVD, which is the US National Vulnerability Database. CVE and NVD are not the same. Todd, do you want to speak to that briefly?
Sure. I believe I'll refer first off, if you want a much longer answer, I refer to episode 1 of this very podcast. I believe we talked about that. But in short, NVD and CVE, they're very different. And the National Vulnerability Database is run by NIST, which itself is part of the Department of Commerce, I believe. Also federal government. And what they do is that they will take as an input the CVE list, and then they go through each CVE ID and rate severity and general. I don't even know why I would qualify with generally. In all cases, they use the CVSS scoring mechanism, which is the, what does that even stand for? Common Vulnerability Scoring System, I believe. And that produces a digit with some precision between 0 and 10, 0 being don't worry about it, why do you even have a CVE, to 10 of drop everything you're doing and patch this thing right now. And they do this on behalf of the civilian federal government networks. So think like basically anything that's not DoD, anything that's not like a military network, but that the federal government has an interest in keeping running. They also do it on behalf of all the critical infrastructure industries. There's 10 of them. These were defined by an executive order from President Obama several years ago. And so there's a lot of users of it. Private networks, generally speaking, don't have to follow the guidance of the National Vulnerability Database. They often find it convenient to do so anyway. They are impartial. They tend to score a little bit high, I would say, compared to like what vendors might think what their scores are, which we can have a whole discussion of like the subjectivity in scoring vulnerabilities. But NVD does a fine job at it. They're very interested in figuring out like the truth of a vulnerability. They will chase down the description and the references that are provided by the CVE program and then make an assessment. And so while vendors are welcome to offer their own CVSS scores as part of filing their CVE IDs, it's not required. And also there is a second source out there called the NVD.
Yeah, so NVD and CVE are not one and the same. As I talk about it being a global program, I have seen other other nations, other countries, doing something somewhat similar to NVD
Yep.
with CVE. So NVD is not entirely unique in that way. And again, we welcome other countries, other regions, other certs to participate as a CNA and or a root, JP certs, a root in the program. So how else is the program changing, Todd?
Wow.
I know so many things, right?
The headline is, oh my gosh, we have so many CNAs now. I'm meme guy holding a bunch of limes and I can't hold all these CNAs. That's probably the most significant change. Over the last, here's the thing, is like when people think about CVE, they usually think about it in terms of when they first learned about it. So if you've been in like the cybersecurity industry for more than a decade, you probably are thinking of CVE in that like decade old kind of context. But no, it's changed. So like, for example, like the whole notion of working groups is relatively new in the history of CVE. Right now, there are, I believe, 5 permanent working groups that all have their own charters. You run one called the OCWG. What does that stand for?
I am the chair of the outreach working group. And
Right.
some of these groups,
outreach and communications, I believe.
outreach
right?
and communications, right? Some of the
Yep.
working groups require you to be a CNA to participate. The outreach and communications working group is one where anyone from the community can participate. You don't have to be a CNA. Todd, tell us about your working
That's right.
group.
Yep. I help run the CNA coordination working group, which you would think would be the same thing as outreach, but it's not. It is just for CNAs. And it's mostly about how CNAs can work with each other, whereas like OCWG is more about like how to get new CNAs.
Right.
And talking about that. There are 2 working groups where you don't even have, like you mentioned, you don't even have to be a CNA to participate. You just have to be like interested in the direction of CVE. And that's the automation working group, or AWG. They're responsible for all the tooling. So if you're interested in like how like technically CVE IDs come into being and all the things about like reservations and collision avoidance and like how all the services actually work and how all the permissions are working and the security model, like you can, and you're not a CNA, you are welcome at the AWG. Other working groups have different requirements. The CNA, like, so my working group, the CNA, CWG, we're all about CNAs. You have to be a CNA. But there are other working groups like the quality working group. There's the strategic planning working group. Those are like more of a case by case. If you're interested in that, but not a CNA, like you can take your chances, ask, and if you have something useful to contribute, I'm sure they'll pick up the phone. Easier though is to become a CNA, because then you'll know like what it's like to be a CVE numbering authority. So like I said, there's no real reason not to be a CNA, so you may as well sign up to be one. Just as long as you got a website, we'll take all comers.
And when I think about the working groups, these are great opportunities to see how the program has changed and is changing. The automation working group in particular, I think is a real opportunity to see how we're scaling and what changes we're making to scale better. And if you like the technical aspects of feeding back into the CVE program, I think that's one that a lot of people would enjoy. If you are a little more of a person who wants to do outreach and work with the PCERTs and the teams who are interested in becoming CNAs, the outreach and communications working group, my working group, is a good opportunity. But also there are just little things that really help other people a lot. If you're a CNA and you are kind of a different sector or maybe you do IoT or you do IIoT, your industrial controls, the My CVE story, where you talk about what your team's experience was becoming a CNA, can be very helpful to other businesses like you. So just a small thing like writing a blog and talking about your experience can help other people on their path to becoming a CNA. So, you can do something simple, write a blog, invest an hour in the CVE program, or, you can volunteer ongoing. We have a lot of opportunities to participate in the program through the working groups. Again, whether or not you are a CNA, there are opportunities for you.
I would say whether or not you're a CNA or a future CNA. One thing I did want to mention that we're running a mentoring program now in the CNA coordination working group. It's basically a matchmaking program. It's incredibly simple. We find new CNAs, we pair them up with, old and crusty CNAs, and they figure out like how to deal with weird cases, basically, right? Like we have a whole bunch of rules and a whole bunch of flowcharts and all that, but we're talking about vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities are almost by definition, undocumented, unintended consequence kind of thing. So we run into a lot of edge cases. And so the navigating those treacherous waters can be a lot easier if you have like an experienced friend to help you along the way. And so not only do we have like this slightly more formal mentoring program, but just like everybody I know that it gets involved, at least in the working groups, are super nice and are more than willing to help out and are eager to get you to a point of success when you are starting out as a CNA, as you go on in a CNA. Like basically it's a self-selecting group of heroes, honestly. Like I get a little teary when I think about it, because it's like, for me, that is the reason to be a CNA. Is like, if you care about security and you care about like vulnerability disclosure and you care about fixing the internet, which we all depend on every day for our literal lives, this is a great way to get involved in that. And so, I run into people like Shannon who can't help but help. I run into all kinds of people involved in the CNA program, especially in the working groups.
That may be the right place to leave off, because I'm so excited about this CNA mentoring program that I would love for you to come back and talk more about the mentoring program and what opportunities it affords potential CNAs and how they might be helped by the program. Do you think that you might be willing to come back and talk to us more about the topic exclusively? I would love that.
I'd be happy to.
I would love that. All right. Well, let's leave off here for today. But this was great. Todd, thank you so much for joining us. And we're excited to have you back. Please come back anytime.
Will do.
Thank you for joining us today on the We Speak CVE podcast, which is available for free on Buzzsprout and the CVE website. If you'd like to participate or suggest a topic, please contact us on the CVE website.